we're to a more perhaps one look on the ground conversation around how cities and migrants and conflicts of perhaps we'll call it contestation how we can engender development from there. In the earlier session, we had arrived at a few conclusions. The first was that there is need for more science, better science policy engagement, whereby academics are able to speak in an appropriate language to the state so that the outcomes of our research can provide the evidence for policy decision-making and interventions. We also highlighted the fact that there is a governance gap, and that governance gap results in actors, informal actors, non-state actors, bridging the gap in service provision and in the context of this conversation with regards to conflict resolution and peace building. We are now going to go into a second conversation that is going to be focused on what do we need to do and how do we need to go about it. And so to do justice to that conversation, we have some of our colleagues online and we have some of our colleagues in the room who are going to speak to those issues. I'll start by inviting Professor Shuaib Louassa of the Erasmus University to join us on the what's this table? On the covered table. To join us for this conversation. Please give him a round of applause. Rebecca Roberts from the Technical University Berlin is already online. Hello, Rebecca. And then we have Patience Obaulo from WANEC, who will join us online in a couple of minutes, and also our colleagues from the IOM who we hope will be able to join online. But that being said, we're going to have a fantastic conversation. Now, this roundtable is hosted by the Migration, Urbanization and Conflicts in Africa project. MUCA is a project that is funded by UKRI under the Arua Research Excellence Program, I beg your pardon, and is a study of 9 African cities focused on drivers of migration and the interface between migration and urbanization and how this interface results in conflict, as well as how those migrants and urban residents are able to navigate conflict and violence. We looked at 9 African cities, 3 in Nigeria, 3 in Uganda, and 3 in Addis Ababa. We're going to start the conversation today with a short presentation by 2 colleagues from Nigeria who will tell us a bit about the work they've been doing, and then we'll have the conversation from there. But one thing I want to say is about the 9 cities. The 9 cities we looked at are in 3 categories. The first category are cities that are mega cities, primate cities that are undergoing massive migration. The second category of cities are cities that are experiencing industrialization. The primary cities are Lagos in Nigeria, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and Kampala in Uganda. The second category of cities are cities that are experiencing a high influx of labor migrants as a result of industrialization. And those cities are Abajana, Lokoja in Nigeria, and then we have Hawassa in Ethiopia and Kasese in Uganda. And the third category of cities are cities that have experienced perennial conflict. And these perennial conflicts have resulted in the influx of migrants and also certain level of spatial reconfiguration, as it were. And these include Jos in Nigeria, Gulu in Uganda, as well as Jigjiga in Ethiopia. Are you ready? Are you guys ready? Okay. Well, we looked at these 9 cities, and the research in the 9 cities we learned quite a number of things. One thing we learned is that people will continue to move. Cities have an appeal for migrants. That's one thing we learned. Another thing we learned is that migrants often have to navigate between the urban advantage and the urban penalty. So they're moving from rural areas to urban areas or to small towns, and they're also moving from small towns to large towns. And some of them are moving from towns in one country to towns in another country. We find that people move for a variety of reasons, primarily for economic reasons. Men tend to move for economic reasons. Women tend to move as a result of marriage, and households often move as a result of conflicts, as a result of crisis. So when you find IDPs, usually you find IDPs moving as a man, his wife, his sister, his mother, and his children, as it were. Now, along the line, there may be trails of, individual migration, but that is something that we found across our cities. We also found that there is a high level of young people being conflict instigators across the various cities we've looked at. In certain cases, it's a case of the contestation for economic resources, the tensions around social identities, the issues around political contestations and access to power, access to the resources of the city. But at the end of the day, like we said in the first panel, in the first roundtable, oftentimes these conflicts, come to bear as a result of governance gaps, whereby the city or the institutional authorities are unable to provide all the resources that are required. And so they respond to migrants, to communities on the margins in a manner that can often be hostile and can also degenerate into violence. So, are you ready for me now? All right, so I'm going to invite Dr. Kennedy Eboka and Dr. Esther Tonte to give us a short presentation on some of the work that we've been doing on this project. By the way, the project was concluded in March this year, at the end of March this year. So we're just kind of putting together our findings and now thinking through the next steps, publications, policy, interventions, and the direct, making sure that what we found is able to impact society. So Dr. Esther and Dr. Kennedy, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, for asking the topic here. Okay. Essentially, I will, for those who were the petition, from the help of at least the more and so the petition from use. So I'm glad I guess for organization from Canada to educate or context of civil bias security provided. What is the former street bus application of first additional association? That makes it this some form of local and international migration. Also remember that placements where the science liberty or symbol of liberty. Yes, I think it's not on.
Yeah, the
It's a constant time. The essence of implementation to highlight and to conflict rather than cities in the world. Now, the city, one of those cities that regional and industrialization appear to stimulate. And
Dr. Kennedy, if you stand and face the room.
well, sorry. Okay. So is it related now? So this all the cities focus and here the process of migration, organization, and companies are driven essentially by new introduction of industrial processes in the community that never knew industrialization. What are the migration characteristics? Down national migrant education from Liberia, Cameroon, Niger, Chad, Eden. All internal migrants have to go back and do because as education serves, because of its location as a complex state and the transit point between the north and the south. Let's go to the research made about the first one. All right. We'll go. Anyway, I like that. So the research for the station is participatory and involving multiple of knowledge, so that after people work down communication for data validation. So the people of the community are essential components of the research process. I will try to talk about this simple spelling. Urbanization has the first primary school in the north that was established in 1865. That tells you that there been a goal to mine and soil coming there from the place of education. Then this symbol of iron of liberty was the place where people were it. Yeah, people were it. That's what somewhere. Say something. Okay, no problems. So there is this iron of liberty in Urbanization, free slave from other neighboring countries and communities come to undertake a kind of ritual process to pronounce themselves or recognize themselves as free. The end of this is to tell you that there has been a goal of different profiles that mind of mind. What are the main findings? For this city, there was increased labor migration flowing to Urbanization as a result of the establishment of that cement. And the migration movements included both food and new generation. But essentially, they consisted of economic migrants coming from the north. We have better migrants, those who are displaced or who are having women opportunity, like the others, but their population was winning. So we have more of economic migrants and social migrants in the. What are the major issues regarding the points? The nexus between migration, urbanization, and industrialization appear to be producing a level of conflict that was unknown in the community, especially between Fulani herdsmen and farmers over access to grazing land. Another category of migrants have to do with how people are coming for economic opportunities and then seeking employment in the new company that's established. So the problem here is that land was central to the conflict, as new migrants tend to have this orientation that because they have ethnic affinity with the owner of the company, then they relate them to any open land. And attempt by the communities to have access to land usually become an issue that talk. Then how many of them again from the south with economic activities ranging on trading and hospitality. Then there was this issue of cultural contradictions, so that the community members were seeing the importation of, to use the word trade, impose trade into culture, like hotel, where the communities have been to resist this kind of importation and that's as a source of conflicts. The other the main conflict with this area. Where we have evidence that outside you true claim that whether that belongs to them because it belongs to because the same company belongs to their ethnic member, tends to be able to access land where it does not belong to them. And any attempt by the community member to want to exert their ownership, then to bring to level of other policy relationship and conflicts. Then what are the nexus between migration, land, and conflicts? We have two segments. One has to do with the herders and the farmers between the fringes. And the core center to have access to land and employment between migrants and the host communities. These are some of the changes that emerge as a result of the introduction of urbanization. You can see hectic traffic, air pollution, and so on and so forth. So some of these factors were part of the drivers of conflict between these governments. What are the issues in terms of mechanisms of ground for conflict management? There was apparent lack of governance structure for conflict management, and the community tend to rely heavily on informal processes. But however, when issues related to land and land ownership is the core problem. The limitation of formal processes like us, because of the binding pronouncement and legal issue, the informal institutions will be invited to solve this problem. So we have territorial tensions, we have governance structure and governance value. So according to one of participants in the interview, we learned the both we have monthly security meetings and weekly council meetings on Fridays, likewise the union leaders too. So this comes to highlight the importance of the bottom-up approach to conflict management as opposed to the and international conflict management that comes from the top. Pressure distributing processes. Religious groups whereby religious leaders like Muslim leaders, Christian leaders, they hold regular meetings to ensure that relationship between these diverse groups continue to go smooth. But we also have it at ethnic relations. Both Yoruba and Hausa all have a different group that make this thing very easy to follow. Then we have gender relation, women group, and youth all participate at the level of informal institution of conflict. So what is left for us is to ensure policy makers and government is to see how we can sustain these processes so that their sustainability can be guaranteed through informal processes, so that the owners, the community will be the one in charge of this management. Because we're talking about development, you must also remember that development can only take place in the absence of conflict. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you. I'll just speak for 2 minutes. What I'm going to say is that also some concept, yeah, sector ratio, spoken about gender, that's the city, a city that was industrialized as a result of the situation of the cement factory, examples, and so on. Evolved from, peaceful and result migration into the city as a form of comfort. But now we're talking about this also. So, we're talking about jobs is also one of the system solving. And in jobs, that's the issue of migration. We try to find out the dimensions of migration in jobs and found out that migration is a result of local and international as well as forced and youth. Also, skilled and unskilled labor. If you recall, Jos is a teen city where people go and then they migrate. So as a result of this, it attracted some form of skilled and unskilled labor. And at some point, Jos became a place where we have ethnic clashes, religious clashes. So people are forced to move from one place to the other. As it is now, Jos is planned according to religious settlement. If you're a Muslim, there are particular places you can stay, and if you're a Christian then not cross to a Muslim community is as bad as that. And of course, the early history of migration shows the issue of banditry between the Niger and the Chad. As a result of this, people also migrated into Jos. We have violent crises in the northern Nigeria, Boko Haram and banditry. Some of people also migrated to the place as a result of those issues. And then we have a particular respondent who migrated into Jos from Kaduna. And just 2 years after migration, the crisis started and she lost so many things. So these are some of the issues and result of the clashes the conflict that happened in Jos at the time. And in Jos, it has a strong migrant presence, economic and historical antecedents, as well as West African countries from north and south of Nigeria. And so as a result of this migrant, in the first session, we talked about, migrants contesting for powers, political dominance. We also have the same thing then. The indigenes of Jos, most of them are civil servants, but we find out that the northerners come in and do trading, transportation, all form of business. So economically, the migrants are dominating in that particular city. And so this causes some form of tension between the indigenes of that city and the migrant who has come into the city. And as a result, we have issues. Some of the matters arising revolves around identities, rapid expansion, and integration of the migrant into the city. And again, one major thing that is dominant in this city is contestation around land resources. And so I leave you on that to ruminate while questions come up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Esther Kennedy. So essentially, what this session is going to be talking about is offshoots of what it's talking about, issues around land and what land means to somebody who is an indigent and what land means to a migrant. We'll be looking at territorial tension. We'll be looking at issues around gender, one of the gender dynamics of migration and how that plays into conflicts and conflict resolution. We'll be looking at issues around the internally displaced people when they migrate to some of our cities, and also we'll be looking at them in their capacity as refugees, if you will, whereby they cross international jurisdictions. What are their what are the things that they are able to get away with? We'll be looking at issues around second generational migrants and what it means, what is home to a second generational migrant. We'll be looking at issues around ethnic contestations and ethnic acquisitions especially as with regards to economic resources as well as political power. So we have our discussants in-house and online, but we'll start with the ones that are online. I'd like to welcome Patience Ikpe Obaolo from WANEP. WANEP is an international NGO that collates actions around peace building and conflict resolution across West Africa. So greetings to you, Miss Patience. The first question that we have is directed to you, and it's really, how do we reconcile the very fast pace of migration, the way people are moving into cities, and how it's resulting in conflicts, especially conflicts that can have political consequences, if you will? What are some of the things that we should be looking out for, and what are some of the things that we should be doing, particularly from a civil society point of view?
Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you. It would be nice for
Yeah,
the
the
people
network.
in the room to see you, even if
Okay.
it's just for a moment. Yes, thank you.
Okay. The network over here is a bit unstable.
Yes, so we can see you now. And is it okay if she switches off the video? Yes, you can switch off the video now. Oh dear. We shouldn't have asked her. But we wanted to see her face. Tonti, you can tell her. To log off and log back in. So while we deal with that, I think we can just quickly go straight to Fatima. Fatima is online as well. Okay, so we have Rebecca. Rebecca Roberts is from Technical University Berlin, and Rebecca has been doing some work on. Okay, Patience is back. Please go ahead.
Yes, because I told you last that the internet is a bit unstable.
Yeah.
I could be going on and off, so I decided to put off my video. So
Yeah,
as
that's
earlier
all right.
mentioned, yeah, as we all know that Africa is the least urbanized region and is experiencing the fast rate of urban growth and global development. And all of these are brought about increase in social tension, conflict, and violence in many urban cities. In Nigeria, like in other countries in West Africa, there's an upsurge in conflict across the 6 geopolitical zones in Nigeria presently. And in urban cities such as Jos Plateau, earlier mentioned Kogi, Lokoja, Kogi State, Ibadan, even here in Lagos where I reside, there have been few eruptions of violent conflicts that have led to destruction of properties, of lives, and displacement of persons. And if we look at the conflict in Jos Plateau State, for instance, we realize that the government over time have tried to put infrastructures on ground, like the Plateau State Peace Building Agency, PPBA, to ensure that there is peace within the city. Also, they've also been the military interventions in terms of armed forces. But we still see that there's a large number of internal conflicts in Plateau State, resulting in over 300,000 displaced persons across the states. And these displacements have led to spillover into other neighboring states, including Benue, Nasarawa, and Taraba. So the question is, what can be done to ensure that there is peace within these urban cities? For us in WANEP Nigeria, we work with civil society organizations, and it is key that civil society actors are able to work with local authorities, particularly in the area of building and sustaining peace within these urban cities. ensuring functional democratic systems, and promoting the involvement of women and men in issues of peace and security. So, key recommendations to ensure that urban cities remain peaceful and the sustained development for us would include, based on the establishment of the National Early Warning System, which WANEP Nigeria operationalizes in Nigeria. There is need to institutionalize early warning and early response structures within these urban cities. This will ensure that signs of conflicts are identified on time and they are reported and nipped in the bud to prevent the eruption of conflicts and violent insurgent attack within urban communities. Also, there is need to adopt an inclusive approach to issues of peace and security, whereby, as earlier mentioned, women, youths are not left behind, but they are brought on decision-making tables and are able to bring on board their concerns, their views, and needs when it comes to issues of peace and security within urban communities. Then the issue also of how do we engage the youths, particularly within and outside educational institutions. We believe that if a culture of youth is inculcated, if a culture of peace is inculcated in children and young persons, they will be able to embrace that culture and ensure that wherever they find themselves, they are able to resolve issues, disputes, disagreements using non-violent techniques rather than the resort to violence. So thus, the need to adopt peace education within formal and informal structures is key within urban societies, so that children and young persons grow up with the knowledge of peace and embrace a culture of peace and change. Furthermore, there is need to adopt comprehensive legislations to stop the issue of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, which over time have been a bane within urban communities. This also will ensure that issues of violence is also nipped in the bud. The heightened risk of vulnerability of women and girls are further reduced because issues of sexual and gender-based violence will be tackled within this domain. So for us, we feel that with these key recommendations, the government and society organizations will be able to work in partnership to ensure that urban communities are made peaceful for the citizens to cohabit in. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Patience. That's excellent. Issues around early warning systems and response structure, inclusive approach, peace education, and legislation. I go quickly to Rebecca, and my question to Rebecca, Rebecca has been working on and with IDPs in cities over the last 5 years or so. Rebecca, how do you see peace building and engagement? How do you see it working in the situation where IDPs are nationals of the country, are citizens of the country, but the regulatory framework does not adequately capture the contents of their vulnerability? How do we work to support them in that kind of environment?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Prof. And thanks for inviting me. I think that the issues around supporting IDPs who are actually citizens of their own country is very complex and interconnected. I think for me, from my own research and even the work that we've done together, the first thing that I'm seeing from data is that the lack of comprehensive understanding on translocal forced migration. So we are not yet looking at IDPs as people who can move because they are citizens of their own countries We are also restricting, so the Nigerian policy on humanitarian framework sees an IDP as somebody who lives in camp and has failed to consider the fact that the extension of protraction in Nigeria means that at some point people will move if they cannot find a solution. So I think the lack of understanding on translocal forced migration is the first one. The second one, I've mentioned a bit in the first point, is the impact of the humanitarian framework in Nigeria, whereas in other countries, for example, in Kenya, IDPs are supported, wherever they are. I've seen camps in Nairobi that are supported from various structures, both at the international, the national, and even the state level. In Nigeria, that's not possible because the framework of response is restricted again to camps. And so that limits the state government's ability to be able to really do anything about the situation. And the third one is that so that leaves the local communities as the host, who see themselves as forced. So they are forced to host people who they didn't know would be staying for that long. And because they've stayed, for extensive amount of time, and the local communities have no support, no structural support from anyone, both NGOs, government, and on all kinds of humanitarian actors, it means that conflicts are beginning to emerge. Now, although I see that the conflicts emerging are not so special or different from the ones that the local communities themselves has, it has an element of fear. So my fourth point would be the insecurity crisis in Nigeria. So the cause of Boko Haram is making people panic, and then people are also panicking on losing their territorial control and share of their land, for example. So land conflicts are emerging, competition for scarce resources, which is really, if you look at it, stems down from the fact that people are paranoid. So local communities are paranoid of insecurity in their community. So I think those are the four main points that are emerging from my own research.
Right, thank you very much. We'll get back to you. Rebecca has highlighted issues around conflicts around legislation at the scale of national and the reality of IDP settling and migrant communities being a localized issue. She's highlighted issues of stigmatization. So we come to you, Professor Shuaib Luasa, and the question I have, that I'm going to direct at you is a twofold one. The first is, are you able to legislate peace? How do we legislate peace when it comes to issues as sensitive as land and identity? Because who is a host and who is a migrant, who is an IDP, who's welcome and who is not, has to do with identity. And land in a typical African community, whether urban or not, has a direct link to identity, to inheritance, to the sense of self. How do we legislate this, especially looking at it through a peace lens?
Thank you very much, Professor Lawanson, and thank you for the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here at my first LSA conference. And always a pleasure to be back in Lagos. Going directly to your question, I think some of the scholars of migration and conflict, like Oxby and others, have really provided some powerful and useful frameworks that we can use to answer this question. And one of that is not just the types of conflicts, but also this notion of gradation of conflict, in the sense that you can have conflicts that are inherent and passive in a way, but you also have conflicts that are in between, all the way up to those that manifest as violent. So what is clear with that notion is that perhaps it's very difficult to legislate or control passive conflicts, because you will have this lingering historical, social, cultural contestations and clash of interests around land and around resources. But over time, and therefore we have to recognize the temporalities of these conflicts, over time, at some point, depending on the political situation, depending on the conditions, depending on whether somebody deliberately or inadvertently triggers the conflict into a violent one, things will happen as violent. And we've seen this in Moka, in the case of Gulu, where land was appropriated by people from outside Gulu, and it remained a passive sort of conflict contestation. And with time, it almost emerged into a violent one, where some of the MPs even, staged protests and decided to even mobilize the locals to try and protest against some of the outsiders. We consider outsiders from Gulu, the city that we talked about earlier. So that it's possible to legislate conflicts, but perhaps the side of violence, where through legislation, then you can put up legislation that tries to either penalize or reward those who avoid it, including the peace agencies like the one that we heard about. Those could be created there. But what is important, in my opinion, is to try and do other sort of solution, come up with other solutions that keep the contestations and the clash of interest as passive, because I don't see an ideal situation where you can hardly have conflict. It will continue to be there, but inherent and latent and therefore passive. And that relates to resources, that relates to cities as well, with all the migration that is going on in and out of the cities and from cities and different cities, that is likely going to continue. Thank you.
So passive conflict, is that not like waiting for the volcano to erupt at some time?
No.
Well, that's what it. So I think at this time it's good to listen to the audience. How do we navigate this complexity? How do we think about keeping conflict at a passive level for it not to, oscillate and become an active volcano that blows up in everybody's faces? And how do we legislate peace? So we'll take comments, questions, reflections. Everybody's quiet. No responses. Must be a boring panel. Okay. All right, 1, 2, and 3. Please go ahead, Rob.
I was just wondering if there's any scope or feasibility for the, let's call them the foreign authorities, the governments, local and regional, to leverage on the influence. So maybe community leaders, traditional rulers, to actually help manage challenges around conflict. Is that at all feasible in the way the formal authorities operate and view these challenges?
Okay. We'll take a few more comments and then we'll respond. Yeah.
Thank you. I think drawing from experience around
Sorry, you didn't introduce yourself.
my name is Gene in Washington.
Okay.
I find it difficult to see how presently with the rapid urbanization process in Lagos, especially this reform, and the involvement of government in land, communal land grab, it will be very difficult to either legislate to keep conflicts at the passive level because of the involvement of state actors. Because when state actors come into land issue, it becomes very complex. The model of the identity of the new owners, whether you are able to do what you want at that particular point in time, that we need to come back to consent. So as much as we have, the moment you have compensation over ownership, then I think conflict is inevitable.
Right. No, that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ismail Ibrahim from Unilag mass communication department, I'm not sure that you can actually legislate peace, but perhaps maybe there are some enablers of conflict that perhaps you can try to legislate around. And I will be speaking about the media. In most societies, the media play important roles as enablers of conflict, depending on the way they actually cover some issues. And government can come around and try to, play some sort of control or regulations in terms of the sort of content that can be shared or disseminated in the media. There should be some context that we know obviously will promote conflict that should not be allowed to be circulated in the media. And I think perhaps also the media can play an important role by putting important context, to when they write stories about migration. It's important to put context so that people can be better educated, when they are reading stories from the media.
Just everyone was presented, but there's something. Okay, thank you very much. Everyone has presented, but there's something I expected you people to touch on, all the three of you, which has not come up. I think there's the whole issue of development, urbanization, also introducing new categories of claimants to the land. It could be an urban authority like government, which has decided to come up with a new state of Lagos, and this is how it's going to be run. This is where the water will pass. This is where the road will pass. This is where we have a construction. And of course, when you have new arrivals in the city or new owners of the land, whether legitimate or illegitimate, it does create a certain category of, one, it dispossesses those who were there. Like I imagined before we who occupy Lagos today arrived, there were occupants there before, but whose lifestyle and livelihoods have been relegated because it's not what we want in the new Lagos. So there's the aspect of dispossession, not just direct of land, but also of livelihood and of ways of life. Then there are new legislations that come up of how then should someone behave in that space. And then of course you have new classes introduced. Like for example, when Kennedy was presenting, so you have those who arrive in the city without resources becoming people who live on the margins or in the shanties. But then you also have those who were already there, but are not part of the new development or of the urbanization, also being pushed off on the margins. So I think these kinds of things create contestations that we need to pay attention to when we are talking about how do we legislate for peace. I mean, in Kampala, you've had some people in the slums of Kampala who argue about this was their land. So you're trying to say, don't be here or don't do that there, but that is their land and that's their customary land. Of course, the state always argues by the time we were colonized, there were no people here. So it depends on who has the history, and the state has the archive, so it claims there were no people there. So these tend to create a contestation, and that contestation could be physical fight for land or just violations of everything the urban authority says. Don't construct here, people put up shanties. Or it could be new manifestations in terms of urban crime because people have been dispossessed, people are on the margins. They see development, but they cannot partake of it. So what do? They look at those who seem to be getting by and take something off them. It could be picking a phone or it could be burglary. So I think as we theorize this migration and conflict in Africa, we need to take cognizance of actually what creates conflict in an urban city in Africa. It's largely the social inequality that comes with the urbanization. And then the dispossessed have to take it from those who seem to have something. Thank you. Sorry, ma'am.
My name is Khadija Tioso. I just want to kind of prefer a solution that helped my family and I. When I was growing up, we moved from or migrate from Sokoto to Kanu. That was the one I could remember because I was a bit younger when we were in Sokoto. So any area we choose to live, my dad will go to the emir or the Dugari or whatever the name we call that over there, and register his presence. Tell them this, my family and I have come to live with your people. We are peaceful people and like that. So in the case of any eventuality, we're always protected because people kept wondering, we live in the midst of them, and when there is crisis and they don't come to our houses or come to embarrass us. In fact, if we are outside, they will volunteer to go and get anyone that is outside inside. So there's this sense of saying, I'm just going to this place. I'm sure if you're traveling out, you need to register your presence that you are there. The country will know about your coming and you're going out. So most areas when people just move, especially in Nigeria, we just feel, it's our own, it's our own, it's our own. We don't seem to say, okay, look, I am here, I'm new. What are those things that is acceptable and those things that are not acceptable? In order not to, because everybody have a culture and have the right to protect what they have. So we need to appreciate what they have because we are there, and we need to also, try to kind of blend sort of so that we don't create so much to avoid conflict. Thank you.
And Dr. Kennedy and you, and then just move up to the results.
Okay, thank you, Prof. I was just thinking on this issue of how to make peace a permanent thing, really, if we're able to get to that level. But my mind went to what Professor Abba said earlier. For instance, if we assume, and it has been established, that the bottom-top approach for peace management at the grassroots level is very important, especially for responding to the early signs. Then if you have a situation in Lagos where they are now, I don't know whether to try to stop or ban any kind of ethnic association, then how do we respond to conflicts at the early age? I think what could be done is how we can manage these processes, because in Obajana, for instance, it's working very well, so that we have leaders of different ethnic groups forming associations and holding regular meetings with the community members. And it is only when they have issues that they cannot handle that the state interjects through the instrumentality of legal and formal agencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Of course, I want to say that we can actually, is that? Introductions. Okay, my name, I'm David. Okay, I'm an economics at University of Lagos. So I want to say that we can actually legislate against crime and disharmony and insecurity in the land. So I think that we can look at the drivers of those crises, the drivers of insecurity and all of that. And then the government begins, to look ahead and legislate laws, that will guide against such new developments in the society. For instance, the cattle range, that is still under debate in the National Assembly in Nigeria. Of course, it is subject to interrogation, but is a way ahead that, the herdsmen are not allowed to be moving from one state to another. So I think that is key. Then one of the causes of crisis is the fact that people are poor. And when people are poor, they are susceptible to engaging in one crime rate or the other. Okay, so, and to actively fight poverty, so it means that the government must continue to strengthen its social policy, especially the transformation of social policy. That will not address only the vulnerables in the society, but all levels of persons in the society. And I think that's critical. And to actually achieve that, I think the government, for instance, globally where capitalism is being practiced, and in some places, they do not practice primitive capitalism, which we practice. So it's quite important that in Africa, the government has to move away from primitive capitalism to an enlightened capitalism, where they provide, in spite of the fact that they practice capitalism, government, provides the basic things that people need. For instance, free education, even at the level of primary, secondary schools and all of that. When people are educated, they understand what it means to be peaceful. The tendency for which they engage in crime rates and insecure activities will reduce. Okay, again, I also want to talk about industrialization leading to insecurity and the rest of that. Of course, in economics, when we talk about industrialization, we are referring to the growth of industries, not just within a state, but within a particular country. So I think, I'm not sure that in those countries in Africa, they're actually experiencing industrialization. I think what they are experiencing, the tendency of industrial growth, that in some locations, industries are coming up, some are leaving and all the rest of that. So probably they are experiencing concentration of industry in some areas, and that is a plus. Then what should the state be doing once we see that industries are growing? And just like we said, that there could be some tensions created as a result of urbanization and the resources available, and then which may not be available, and the tension from who are citizens, who are not citizens. So I think it's quite important that even the employers of labor within that circle, has something to do in terms of engaging the indigenous and all of that. Then the role of the ballers and the community leaders, as I said, and also the religious leaders. That's very key. And finally, the NGOs, because they have been so strong in resource mobilization in Africa. Of course, the gap they are tending to bridge, and just like the other discussant said, so we must continue to engage them and benefit from their, what they have to offer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I should go back online, and the next question is patience. I want to take it back to the issue of the early warning system and the early response structure, and how your organization is able to transmit the information to those who are able to take action. In the first instance, how do you collate information that triggers off a warning that there's a potential risk in a certain place and the kind of risk? And how do we make sure that those who are able to take actions either to dissipate the threat or to respond swiftly have the information and the tools to effectively respond? Okay, over to you, Ms. Patience. You're still muted. Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. As earlier mentioned, In WANEP Nigeria, we have what we call the National Early Warning System.
I'm sorry again.
And within Nigeria, we 80 community monitors. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. So
The network is really
critical mass
poor.
of over 80 community monitors that feed across the 6. Okay. I know. Is it better now?
Yes, let's try again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
we can hear
So
you.
as earlier mentioned, we have what we call the National Early Warning System. And it's a system whereby real-time conflict monitors are able to easily identify signals within their communities and feed in real time using a mobile Android phone or a computer or a tablet, feeding information into the system from wherever they are, whatever community they find themselves. So the early warning department, the officers, the team members in the department verify this information on daily basis. They verify information on daily basis to ensure that information gotten are verified with also things like the newspaper, for instance, calling on the state coordinators, because we have state coordinators across the 6 states in Nigeria, to also keep tabs on what is ongoing within the states to ensure these informations are not rumors. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, to ensure informations are not rumors. So when informations are gotten through the National Early Warning System, we have conflict analysts who analyze these informations, and they are sent out on daily and weekly basis through outputs referred to as weekly highlights, situational briefs, situational tracks. And we have a link serve of over 1,000 stakeholders, state and non-state actors within Nigeria and also the West African region, including ECOWAS and African Union. So they are also able to use this information and alert relevant authorities, also putting forth recommendations to key government actors, helping them know what they need to do at a particular point in time. So on daily basis, the monitors feed into the National Early Warning System, and these outputs are made available to these stakeholders across within Nigeria and outside the country. That's how the early warning system works, to ensure that whatever signals are gotten at community level, it is gotten across to relevant stakeholders to ensure that they have prompt information to intervene in whatever situation that might erupt in conflict within communities.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. The next question will go to Rebecca, and the question will be around, what do you think a social transformation policy will look like? In the earlier session, one of the things that was highlighted was also poverty and the fact that communities in the margins are quite vulnerable. And when it comes to policing the city, recognizing who is a migrant and who is not, and particularly the othering of migrants, it is actually those who are on the lower economic classes that are most affected. My question will be, given your earlier statements about how IDPs are not captured in the current humanitarian policies, what should a social transformation policy look like that captures the various classes of vulnerability, especially those who have been impacted by forced migration?
I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think the first point would be looking at how they already live together. So how both the host and the IDPs, what is their process of hosting the IDPs? What kind of challenges do they see that the IDPs add to their community, and collaboratively designing the social policy with both groups separately and then together, so that so that other issues that are beyond poverty, because in my own experience, yes, there's poverty, and poverty affects the dynamics of the relationship and between the IDPs and the host, but there are other deeper issues that are sort of like the big elephant in the room that we're not really interested in looking at as a nation. For example, the issue of the fact that people are paranoid about people that they thought would be in their place for a specific time, and that has extended because in even other communities that we have worked together on projects with you, Prof. One of the things in comparing the IDPs to other people, other groups of people who move, one of the key things that you see is that the IDP is treated very differently to other groups of migrants, including refugees from other African countries. For example, where the refugees or low-income migrants can rent a piece of land as an individual, the IDPs cannot. And so understanding why does that issue exist? How do the local communities see it? And how do the IDP see it? And what do they think is the solution would be, an effective way, in my perspective, of designing social policy that looks beyond poverty, but looks more at social cohesion. What are the issues that are emerging, and why do these issues exist? And how can both groups live together? Because one of the things, again, referring back to my own research, one of the things that local communities have said to me across Lagos is that nobody supports them. They are hosting IDPs. Nobody understands the issues that come with this, and that makes it difficult for them because they are starting to feel like IDPs are taking over their land, are land grabbing, are farming in places that do not belong to them without permission. So understanding all those kinds of issues and co-designing a solution with both groups.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Now we come back to Prof. Luasa. The same question, what does the social transformation policy look like, especially in light of what Professor Kay had called primitive neoliberalism, or perhaps enlightened neoliberalism? What will a social transformation policy look like?
Thank you once again. I think I could start to address that question by making a few, headline statements. One is that in Africa, generally speaking, I think that agrarian economies are stagnated and excess labor is moving to the cities. And that excess labor is putting pressure. And let's not forget that there are also people moving, not because of the marginal productivity in agrarian economies, but also because of armed conflicts. And that is the double-edged sort of process which further stagnates the agro economy and also puts pressure on the cities where the life skills of majority in the city do not match the formal jobs. So recent studies, for example, have shown that Africa's progression through structure transformation will be very difficult because over 60% of people lack life skills that can actually not see them, going up the ladder in terms of employment. So what would the social policy, transformative social policy look like? I think that we have to rethink the economic model. The submission earlier, I think that the experiment of linear economic development, I think, has failed in Africa. We have to appreciate that there has to be a different way Africa needs to develop. Foreign direct investments and industrialization are not the solutions in Africa. But rethinking that requires us to appreciate what value and resources there are in Africa and therefore add value to whatever we have. But that is not enough. We also have to reshape the relationships that we have within Africa in the States, but also the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. And we know that there's even much more political complication around that because different states in African continent have different types of relationships with bilateral or multilateral. And that often conflicts when it comes to economic development of Africa. So for me, social transformation would have to be inclusive in the sense that we have to appreciate the skill sets that are available, the resourcefulness, and therefore redesign economic opportunities that would absorb the excess labor in the cities, as well as the excess labor that is emerging within the rural areas of Africa. That way, you will also create opportunities where you perhaps don't even have to think that much about refugees or IDPs or people who are migrating from different places within the state or between cities and cities. Why? Because if there are opportunities that they can tap into, then there's perhaps no need to think about that much directly about the peace, and perhaps conflict will be reduced. And that's what I mentioned earlier, that there's possibility for that would then create a situation where perhaps much of the clashes of interests and the contestations will remain seated in the passive zone rather than in the violent zone. And it is much more difficult to legislate passive conflict or peace or than legislate violence. But even when you think about legislating violence, again, it brings back the questions of freedom. What is peace if I'm not free to make choices on what I have to eat in the city? What is peace if I can't make choices on where to live in the city or how to be mobile in the city? What is peace if I cannot relate with the people, my peers, whatever, in the city as I wish? So if you control peace or violence, you also take away some freedom. And yet it seems like part of the deconstruction of the linear universalism of development, which I think in African context is failed, if not failing. I think we need to rethink how we approach urban development and generally to create a social transformative environment.
Yeah, I agree. So now my question is to you, colleagues. In addition to what has been said, what are the prerequisites for this social transformation policy? We understand that people are moving and people are moving for economic reasons. They're also moving as a result of conflict. And when they get into the city, they are unable to integrate properly, primarily because they're both institutional and systemic, enablers or obstacles in their path. So if we are to have reforms with regards to humanitarian policies and, social development, what are the prerequisites? What are the things we must take into consideration? We've heard that we must take into consideration the lived experience, that not all the poor are poor, that the poor also have different categories. We've learned that migration, we also have to think about development from a decentralized view so that not so many people need to travel, not so many people need to move in search of their development aspirations. So development as a decentralized concept is also something that needs to be taken into consideration. What else do we need to look at? Yes.
I think I found interesting what you both
Please
said.
introduce yourself.
My name is Benny. I work on economic history, also geography science. So I found interesting what you said about the relationship with states. So my view is, what about actually reviewing the borders which was imposed after during the 60s? Because I think there was some negotiation. There was a push from African countries to say we don't want those borders because they don't represent our lived reality. But actually, I think from what I read and heard, there was a block from the West saying that no, you have to stay as it is. And what about as well thinking about the environment from the perspective of climate change, to use actually indigenous knowledge, how to look after the lands, how to look after the agricultural products which are better suited maybe for the health of the people locally. Because some type of food may not be suitable for different category of people, like milk. So I know that there's a high level of lactose intolerance among Africans, even though I don't want to put Africans in one basket, because there's a lot of Africa is where there's most diversity in terms of genetics. So I think when I'm taking the example of a lady who started breeding, planting trees, and kids in Kenya continue doing that, planting trees. And also there's a project of green belt starting in Mauritania or Senegal. But actually, I haven't seen anything about that in Nigeria, because it could be something to think about, not only for Nigeria, but the whole Sahel region, because that's where conflict will emerge, because of the fight for resources. And when I listened to my concierge from Chad, where I live in London, is thinking actually saying that actually even Nigeria should share the resources, but maybe people in Nigeria may not already there's a latent conflict about resource sharing because of access to water, concentrated in some region of Nigeria, even access to land, fertile land, or even grass, anything. But I think going back and thinking about the way people eat, because you don't have to eat a burger, for instance, and maybe they're better alternative to burger, like insects. Because my mother grew up eating insects, for instance, in Nigeria. So I don't know, maybe some people living in city may disagree on those habits, but I think looking at land as a way to shape a different form of development, because economic development doesn't have to be about earning more money at higher GDP. Because when you look at what's going on in Nepal, I think it's Nepal, a neighboring country, they don't see GDP as a measure, and it's not the right measure actually to measure economic development.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Sarah again, and this cycle of social transformation has triggered a lot of thinking, especially after Professor Swaibu Lwasa has submitted. And it goes back to even a debate we are having in Uganda now of what would a city suitable for Africans look like. What we do is, of course, the colonials start, pre-colonial, there were centers of trade in places. These became developed into urban authorities following particular patterns. And right now, the academy we have in urban authorities, like the two of you and all the centers of urbanization in our universities, are operating with a modern with a particular Western conceptualization of a city, of what an urban authority should look like, how the housing should be, how the land should be, who should be in, who should be out. And like where I come from, of course, many places have become cities in Uganda today. But one thing which characterizes African cities, including those in Uganda being two, but mainly now, let me say Uganda. Yesterday I was in town and it was not any different, is the level of waste and the lack of proper waste management. And the waste is not because people just don't know how to deal with waste, but it is that the way the cities are formed does not take into cognizance what actually people eat and what they use. If you come to Ugandan cities, a staple like the banana comes with a lot of peelings, with a lot of banana leaves, the way we cook it and whatever, it comes with a lot of things. And then it takes a long time to decompose. So that actually is a contributor to a lot of waste in our cities. We are largely eating things fresh. The processing of those kinds of waste is really not there. So the cities end up looking filthy. And I've always asked, what would a city in Africa from an African perspective look like? Can we have cities formed around the identity, around the life of Africans? Because if we don't do this, the African will continue being a problem to the city, okay? And so if now Dr. Swaib is encouraging us by saying the linear model doesn't work, we have to rethink the model of development. Can we also rethink the model of a city in Africa, where it is an urban authority structured around the lives of the people who occupy it, not a template from elsewhere, and you either fit in this template or else your city is ranked this low or this parameter. Thank you very much.
I agree with you. The idea of
But I don't have an answer. Can we
the idea of city ranking is personally vexatious to me, because what makes one city better than the other? You know, what even makes the city outside of it, the people who live in the city? And if a city works for its residents or for its citizens, why does it then rank so much lower? Especially when we know that oftentimes the indicators for this ranking speak to the, I like this word, primitive neoliberal considerations, you know, oftentimes, because we see that there was this one, the Smart City Index, and one of the considerations is the number of Apple stores in a city, you know, determines how smart the city is. Now, a city like Lagos has a higher internet penetration, a higher number of people using mobile phones than many other cities in the world. But the kinds of mobile phones that our people use are Chinese mobile phone that allows them to make calls and do the basic WhatsApp. They don't need an iPhone for that. But our city ranks much lower because many of us don't use, you know, the iPhones that will enable or that will require having multiple Apple stores in that particular city. The other one is, I like to say this one, on the Economist livability ranking, one of the indicators is the number of nightclubs in a city. Now, the typical African, you know, thinking says that the daytime is for the living and the nighttime is for the spirits. And so we don't have an active nightlife, maybe for reasons of poor infrastructure, but even, you know, from a cultural point of view, because we have considered the nighttime to the spirits. So why does it then make us rank lower on a livability scale when, you know, culturally, you know, it is you know, that is our reality, that the day is for the people and the night for the spirit. We have just a few minutes to the close of this session, and I will now invite our discussants for final reflections, 2 minutes each, and then I'll say a few words to close. It has been a really interesting session, I must say. We'll start with Professor Swaib, and then we'll move on to our colleagues who are online. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Chair. City ranking, economic life ranking, state ranking, we are plugged into the global economic structure. And it might be difficult to disentangle from it. But what we need to think about is how do we diversify that economic structure? So that issue speaks a lot to the many comments that you raised, I forget your name, about the reversal of the boundaries, which I think has a downside of balkanization. But we know that if we're plugged into the economic structure, there's a lot more benefits around agglomerated economies and intertrade than balkanization, because balkanization comes with a lot of kingdomships and those kind of issues that might not be very good for the transformation of Africa. And I also think that when it comes to issues to do with climate change and the response, there's a growing community around climate expertism, which I push back on, because a lot of solutions that are in IPCC, I'm part of IPCC, at least they are 5, they are 6, coordinating lead author, a lot of solutions are already in practice in Africa. But systems are being established to sell those solutions to Africa. So that climate expertism, I think your answer in respect to indigenous knowledge answers everything. The Great Green Wall is not the first that has been done. There are many conservancies in Africa that date back in history where traditional systems actually conserved them. So these models that are coming from elsewhere, I think we need to push back, but we have to be very careful that we are already plugged into the system. But what is important is how do you maintain that but diversify? And then over time, perhaps, that will be perhaps 100, 200 years, break loose from that universalistic, linear economic development model that has been, flagged around with a lot of drumsticks. What is happening in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Uganda, the laws that are being protested. What is not being spoken about is the behind the scene negotiations with the financial infrastructure and all the conditions to go with that. So the more you pull out the what do you call the subsidies from the economy on fuel, the more it hits up the economy, the more that translates to the local person who is buying a meal on the street somewhere in Lagos, and that bites directly. Now, those financial systems do not care about me as a local person on the street. They care about the credit worthiness, going back to the ranking, the credit worthiness of a country. So we need to push back on all that. Thank you. I submit.
All right, thank you. Rebecca, final words? You're muted, you're still muted.
Sorry, I didn't know I was muted. I think for me, it's just for us to start looking at how to integrate the rights of displaced people wherever they go, and looking at their rights from a nationality perspective, and also looking at them as displaced people who move. That will be all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Ms. Patience.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope I'm a bit clearer now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Very,
We can
very
hear you.
erratic. Okay, so as earlier mentioned, when we talked about the issue of early warning, because I need to put emphasis on that, which involves the collection of data and dissemination in order to ensure that conflict is prevented and mitigate threats to human security within urban communities. There is need for us to have these early warning structures on ground. And I would say that when these structures are on ground, conflicts can be prevented within urban communities and ensure that the space for peaceful coexistence is also embraced. Then we talk about the issue of involvement of women and young persons in of peace and security. For us, no one should be left behind. Inclusiveness, or I say inclusivity, will also include persons living with disabilities within these urban communities. So they feel a sense of belonging and also are able to coexist with others within the community. So these are my final words. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, colleagues, for contributing so enthusiastically to the conversation. By way of final reflections, I will say that the idea around migration, urbanization, and conflict is a very complex one. But at the level of, at the city scale, it can be broken down into ensuring that triggers are adequately dealt with and dealt with early enough, that issues around social inequities that often tend to trigger the quest of economic or resource contestations, that they are well addressed, and that legislation should be tailored towards breaking these social inequities and ensuring that those who need, resources are given opportunities by which to get the resources. We also find that there's a need for us to take a decolonial lens to thinking about these issues. What can indigenous knowledge systems tell us about how to better govern our cities? What can we learn from what our communities are already doing in keeping the peace, in ensuring that our cities are more sustainable, whether from a social or environmental perspective? After all, the non-state actors, traditional leaders, religious leaders, we see as currently perhaps the most trustworthy custodians of peace in our communities. And then finally, the issues of land and territoriality. It's something that continues to rear its head, and it's something that we really need to take a closer look at. How do we reconcile how volatile issues around land ownership, land contestation, land administration, land regulation? How can we understand, why is it such a volatile, ecosystem, and what is required for us to really break it down and mitigate the kinds of conflicts that rise from it? And finally, the question that I started with, how do we legislate peace? We've seen that it is easy to legislate conflict, and perhaps it is easy to legislate conflict management. But our future, looking at a better urban future, is to look at a peaceful urban future, because it is only in the atmosphere of peace that prosperity can be all encompassing. So my final words to you will be for us to think a bit more about how to maybe not legislate, how to embed peace in the way we think as urban citizens and in the way we practice. Professor Ibrahim gave us one teaser about using the media as a catalyst. Ms. Patience gave us another one about peace education across all levels. Can we start from here? Peace education, peace information, and then what next needs to be done? On that note, and with that assignment, we'll bring this roundtable to a close. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It is 12:30, so we have a short break until the next session. Thank you.